Hi, my name is Huck Gutman. I'm a member of the board of the Vermont Humanities Council, and I'm also a professor of English here at UVM. And it's my honor, actually, it's a very great honor to introduce you to this talk by Robert Gordon. I won't go over his biography. It's in your packet. I think biographies are important. I think people work very hard to become chaired professors, as he is at Northwestern. I think they work very hard to publish a lot of books and articles. I think they work very hard, and it's a great accolade to be elected to distinguished councils. And so I don't mean to give short shrift to Professor Gordon by skipping over those things. But as a member of the Vermont Council, I was at a meeting of the program committee, and I did say to Peter Gordon, I hope we're not going to have a conference in which everybody says technology is great. And he said, no, we have Robert Gordon here, and he's going to be coming, and here's his book, and he went upstairs and got it, and it's really fat, and it's really overwhelming, and I thought I'll get it out of the library and skim it. And I want to tell you, I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. It is an overview of who we are and how we got to be where we are and how we are profoundly different than the people who lived at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a book about the great inventions of the later 19th century, especially electricity and the internal combustion engine, and what they meant as those inventions were deployed in the 20th century, and especially as they permeated modern life between 1920 and 1970. As those of you who heard him last night know, those innovations were, and those movements of our society were, in a sense, non-repeatable in his view. There was a kind of a singularity. You can only once go from rural to urban, from agricultural to industrial, from hauling water into your house to having a spigot. And it is his view, as he said last night, that there are three industrial revolutions, the two we know of, the invention of the steam engine and mechanized textile manufacture was the first industrial revolution. The second one was what I've just mentioned, electricity and the internal combustion engine, and what followed from that, which are not only domestic appliances, but also all the mass media that we know and think as being part of our world. The third being one we are inhabiting now, which is the invention and deployment of ways of marshaling information electronically. He's going to speak to us about what lies ahead as the era of great growth, which kind of ended in 1970 with the deployment of things like air conditioning, dishwashers, jet planes, telephones, everything we know in our modern life. He's going to talk about what lies ahead for us as we look at this third industrial revolution, but also a decline in growth. So it gives me very, very great pleasure to welcome. I can't tell you how good his book is. I hope you all go out and buy it, or if you don't buy it, I hope you read it. His book, which is called The Rise and Fall of American Growth, is just spectacularly readable and unbelievably elucidating about who we are. So it gives me, as I said, very great pleasure to welcome Robert Gordon.
Thank you, Huck, for that nice introduction. I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to try not to repeat much, if anything, of what I said last night. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a preview. Let me start and remind everyone why we should care about economic growth. The faster is economic growth, the more we can consume, the more poor people can afford to eat and pay rent, the more middle-income people can afford to pay their health insurance bills, can afford to save up for their children to go to college. More growth makes room for more investment, which makes us better off in the future. And more output means more jobs and a lower unemployment rate. Since 2009, we've been growing as an economy at a rate of 2%. The 2% growth rate has been accompanied by growth of employment of 1.5%, which is a very impressive rate of growth of jobs that's now been persisting for the last 8 years. And how has that been made possible when the growth of our adult labor force is only growing at about 0.5%? And the reason is, obviously, that we have been pulling people out of unemployment into jobs consistently for the last 8 years, during which the unemployment rate has fallen from 10% in late 2009 to it's now down to 4.1%. Unemployment can't decline much further. The lowest unemployment has been in the last 50 years is 3.8%. We're already at 4.1%. We're almost as low as we can get. And so, how fast can the economy grow at a stable unemployment rate, which we're just about at? So this is looking into the future and asking what kind of growth can we expect if the unemployment rate reaches a very desirable and healthy bottom of somewhere around 4 or 3.5%. Well, the first thing we face is that the population is growing slower than it used to. Fertility rates are down. The bugaboo of the Trump administration, illegal immigration, has stopped over the last period since the Great Recession. We have roughly 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, which is about the same as we did 8 years ago. So they're not adding to the labor force as they once did. How fast are hours per person growing? Well, this goes back about 50 years, and the red areas show you where hours per person were shrinking as people took longer vacations and shorter work weeks. In the middle period, shown by the blue, was the era when women entered the labor force, and the net effect of women entering the labor force overcame the natural tendency of weekly hours to shorten as people took longer vacations and worked shorter work hours. And then we move back into the red area, where in addition to the effect of shorter work hours, this talk is a technological marvel. The faster hours per person are growing as they did in the middle period due to the entry of women into the labor force. The more goods and services we can get per member of the population because more members of the population are working. It's gone in the opposite direction in the last 15 years because the women have finished their entry into the labor force, and we've begun to have the retirement of the baby boom generation, and in addition, a big social problem represented by the dropping out of the labor force of many adult men, an important theme of my talk today, which I'll come back to. How fast can output grow per person? We've gotten used to, over the last 100 to 150 years, steady growth of output per person at a rate of about 2% per year. And that continued throughout most of the period shown on the graph, which goes back to 1953. The yellow line is growth in hours per person. The green line is growth in output per hour. And the yellow line is above the green line in the middle period when the women were entering the labor force. And then, as you can see, the yellow line falls below the green line in the last 15 years when we had these negative influences I just mentioned on growth of hours per person. But the overall message is, at a constant unemployment rate, the capability of our economy to create a higher standard of living for the average person has drastically slowed down in the last 5 to 10 years. And we're here today both to understand why and also to talk about some other impediments to the improvement in the standard of living that are not represented solely by the raw figures of gross domestic product per person. Now, In talking about the slowdown, I'm going to be very U.S.-centric, talking about the United States. But the slowdown in productivity growth that you just saw on that green line is shared by all the nations in the developed world. Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, even South Korea, which was a paragon of rapid growth during most of the period since the Korean War, has leveled off and has productivity growth that is no faster than that in the United States. But later on, when I talk about the headwinds that are impeding growth going beyond the pace of innovation, we're going to see that there are some special problems with the United States in our education system, in the rise of inequality, and in what I sometimes call socioeconomic decay, problems with the quality of the workforce, the quality of life, the decline in marriage, and a number of other facts you might refer to as sociology rather than economics. Just to document the slowdown in productivity growth for Western Europe, here in the black line we have the United States with a brief revival in productivity growth in the late 1990s and then slowing down at the very end. And then the blue line for Europe shows that Europe was catching up, growing faster than the United States during most of the post-war era. Europe, for some reason, did not enjoy this temporary revival in the late 90s that most of us associate with the arrival of the internet. And if you look just at the last 5 to 7 years, Europe's productivity, this is referring to Western Europe, the original members of the common market, their productivity growth is just as bad as ours has been. And then, if you look at the developed countries in Asia, including Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, weight them by the size of the economy, you'll see that they had an even more impressive catching up to the United States back in the 60s and 70s. But their productivity growth has steadily fallen. So in the very last years, at the far right-hand side of the screen, that purple line comes down almost to where the United States is. So the innovation issues I'm going to talk about are universal to the developed world. Now, understanding why growth is slowing down requires, symmetrically, that we understand why it increased. There was no economic growth before 1750 or so. People lived mainly on farms with a few farm animals. Most work was done by hand, and people were living very little better than at the time of the Romans. So no economic growth century after century. The first industrial revolution in the late 18th century brought us the steam engine, railroads, steamships, cotton spinning and weaving, and a transition from wood to steel. And that was great. That got some economic growth going, but the real powerful inventions occurred at the end of the 19th century. The last 3 months of 1879 was the most fruitful period for invention in the history of the human race, because in those 3 months we had Edison's electric light bulb invented in October. In December, Carl Benz, who gave his name to the famous Mercedes-Benz company, developed the first working, practical internal combustion engine. And in a little-known experiment, an Englishman in London actually sent the first wireless signals. But what were all these inventions that came together at the end of the 19th century? Electricity, which made possible electric light, power, elevators, streetcars, subways, fixed and portable electric machines, kitchen appliances, and later on, air conditioning. Motor vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, taxis, and air transport made possible by the internal combustion engine. An old invention going back to the Romans, running water, didn't come to the urban American household until the late 19th century, early 20th century. In 1870, virtually no American homes had bathrooms. By 1930, almost all of them did, with toilets and bathtubs. Information and communications witnessed a string of inventions that totally changed the speed of information flow, starting with the telegraph in 1844, the telephone in 1875, and with entertainment devices that included the phonograph and motion pictures, information coming by radio and TV. All of these things occurring within the very brief period between the invention of the telephone in 1875 and the invention of workable television, which was debuted at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Behind the scenes, less noticed, were all the inventions in the sphere of chemicals, plastics, antibiotics, and modern medicine. Plastics had the most fruitful decade for their invention was in the 1930s, and antibiotics were introduced with penicillin at the time of World War II. And throughout all of this, there was a change in working conditions from the absolute drudgery of hand planting and hand harvesting and pushing plows behind horses and how tough that was on the body, together with the idleness in the winter in the northern states, so people were unproductive. A whole enormous change from that kind of back-breaking labor to the kind of work that most people do today, or even did 30 or 40 years ago, working in air-conditioned offices. So many of these transitions, as Huck previewed, could only happen once. We could only once go from a rural to an urban society. Only once could we make the transition from light with kerosene and whale oil lamps that required matches to light them and gave off polluting fumes, to the electric light, silent, easily switched on and off by a switch instead of by the stroke of a match. Only once could we accelerate the speed of movement of human beings from the hoof and the sail of 1820 to the Boeing 707 of 1958, and we're not flying any faster than we were in 1958. Only once could we go from an indoor temperature that varied from very cold in the winter to very hot in the summer to a moderate indoor temperature that we all now take for granted due to central heating and air conditioning. Only once could we move from communication by horseback to communication instantly. Only once could we invent bathrooms and running water and replace the drudgery of the housewife who had to carry pails of water into the house for cooking and bathing. And perhaps most impressive of all in this period was that life expectancy increased twice as fast in the first half of the 20th century as it did in the last half of the 20th century. Yes, we do have a third industrial revolution. We're living through it right now. It started in 1960 with the mainframe computer, and then the mini computer and memory typewriters of the 1970s, and the electronic calculators, and then the personal computer of the 1980s, and the internet of the 1990s, together with search engines and e-commerce. There's been a lot of progress, but the basic progress was accomplished in terms of business methods and productivity already by about 10 years ago. In communication, we've gone from the pay telephone, where you had to put in a nickel or later a quarter, to the mobile phone and the smartphone. And we've had productivity enhancers, including ATM machines, barcode scanning, and credit card authorization that make it so much easier to shop. Now, a number of people have written to me, just reading my book and looking up my email address, and often the book reminds them in some way of something they learned from their grandparents. So in that spirit, I wanted to read you the reminiscence of a grandfather who was celebrating his 60th birthday in 1927, and remembering back to life when he was a child back in the 1870s. And this will help to bring to life the enormous changes that had happened already by 1927 from the 1870s. The homes of my childhood were not built to keep out winter's cold or the summer's heat. They had none of the comforts of our homes today, that is, today in 1927. No furnace, no gas stove, no storm sash, no screens, no plumbing, no sewers, no bathroom or bathtub. They were heated with wood-burning stoves, the fires in which went out at night. The kitchens were bitterly cold in the winter and infernally hot in the summer. Well and cistern water were all outside the house. For lighting, kerosene lamps. I remember well how the snow drifted across the floor of my bedroom in winter and how the flies took possession of the house in the summer. One thing not many people would think about is that window screens were not invented until the 1880s. And so on the farm, there was a nonstop path from the manure in the farmyard to the family dinner table as long as the windows were open. Now, much of this progress was already evident by the late 1920s, and particularly by the late 1930s. And I wanted to read you one other evocative way of thinking about the nature of these changes. At the turn of the millennium in 2000, an author wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal in which he compared the changes that had been made in 2000, 61 years back to 1939, and then comparing them with the changes 61 years earlier from 1939, looking back to 1878. And I'll tell you at the end why he chose 1939. Imagine somebody dozed off in 1939 and woke up in the year 2000. Despite the 61-year blackout, he'd still find a familiar world that made basic sense. He could drive a 2000 vintage car since the steering wheel, gas pedal, and radio were exactly where they were in 1939. He would understand records, telephones, light bulbs, electricity, central heating, x-rays, Social Security, insured savings, women voting, network broadcasting, and airplanes, all without explanation. But suppose instead of jumping forward 61 years from 1939, we went back. Say our man nodded off in 1878 and woke up in 1939. He would blink in disbelief at the world he saw, for nothing of the modern world existed yet. He would not know about gas pedals because there were no cars in 1878. The idea of pictures that moved would be strange. Sending voices and music through the air on invisible waves or inscribing them permanently on discs would have been unexplainable. How would he have comprehended a simple light switch from his age of candles and kerosene? Imagine his reaction to being lifted above the clouds in a DC-3, conversing with someone 10,000 miles away on a phone, or listening to Count Basie. He would be astonished at going up 104 stories to the top of the Empire State Building in an elevator or rushing under it in a subway. Such a nice way of putting the enormous pace of change from 1878 to 1939 and the more moderate pace of change since then. Now, I said I would tell you why this man chose 1939, and the reason is he lives in neighboring Wilmette, Illinois, right next to Evanston, and he happens to own a 1939 Buick. That's why he chose 1939. Now, if we look at the impact of these three industrial revolutions, we can look at the most important indicator of economic growth, which is the growth in labor productivity, output per hour. The height of these three bars shows you, at the very top of the black, gray, and yellow areas, shows you the growth in labor productivity over three eras. On the left you have, and you can't see this, it's cut off underneath the slide. On the left we have 1890 to 1920, in the middle we have 1920 to 1970, and on the right we have 1970 until now. And as you can see, productivity growth was almost twice as fast in the middle period as it was in the first or the second period. Now, some of the growth in productivity was due to better educational attainment. And that was true throughout. Some of the growth was due to more machines per person, something economists call capital deepening, and that was about the same impact in each of the three periods. What was different is the productivity growth that we cannot explain by the advance of education or the advance in the number of machines per worker. And this economists call total factor productivity. It's how productive our economy is, taking account of the hours of labor and the hours of machines. You can see here there's no comparison. Total factor productivity growth, shown by the black area, grew 3 times as fast in the middle period as it did in the first and the last periods. So what happened to make productivity growth so rapid before 1970? It's the fact that the second industrial revolution had so many different dimensions of inventions. In contrast, the third industrial revolution was really focused on one dimension, the information technology revolution associated with mainframe and personal computers. The second industrial revolution altered every aspect of life for consumers and business, whereas the third industrial revolution mainly mattered for business. Consumers had their bathtubs, had their washing machines, had their dishwashers in large numbers by the 1950s and 1960s. The advance from the 1960s until now was really quite small in terms of the consumer standard of living. The only important appliance invented after 1950 was the microwave oven, leaving aside the mobile phone and the smartphone, which we'll come back to. So how does total factor productivity growth look over the post-war period, going back to the early 1950s? As you can see, the 1950s and 60s brought us healthy growth. There was a radical slowdown in the 70s and 80s, a brief revival in the late 1990s that most economists attribute to the arrival of the internet and all of the investment that was made in computers and servers and fiber optic cable and broadband and flat screens. And then in the last 10 years, we're back in the doldrums again with hardly any growth in total factor productivity. Now, the third industrial revolution changed business practices. Think back to the world of 1970 with mechanical calculators, repetitive retyping, file cards, and filing cabinets. In the 1970s, we advanced with electronic calculators and memory typewriters. In the 1980s, arrived the IBM personal computer, which many of you may remember, with the first software that allowed us to do word processing and spreadsheets. And by the end of the 1980s, we'd made a lot of progress. We already had email, we already had electronic catalogs, and business firms were tying together their computers inside the firm. The external internet hadn't arrived yet, but inside the firm, businesses were doing a lot of processing with computers, getting rid of old-fashioned bookkeepers keeping track of things with clunky mechanical calculators. And then came the web, search engines, and e-commerce, and flat screens. And by the early 2000s, airports were converting to electronic check-in kiosks in the airport lobby, and a lot of airport employees lost their jobs. But by 2005, this revolution in business practices was largely over. And today, businesses are pretty much still carrying on their affairs with desktop and laptop computers. Now, one of the biggest changes that was made possible by the invention of small computers were the replacement of paper catalogs by electronic catalogs. Remember when you used to, if you're old enough, you remember when you used to go into a library, the catalog would consist of little cards in wooden boxes. And the cards wouldn't tell you whether the book was on the shelf or not. Now we have electronic catalogs with unlimited storage capacity that tells you whether you're in a hardware store or in a nursery and garden shop or in an auto parts department, how much in stock you have of an innumerable supply, and we're all familiar with Amazon and the millions of items that are available there. And so the transition from card catalogs and paper catalogs to electronic catalogs was one of the big transitions, but that also was complete by 2005. So everywhere you look, you see standing still in office methods with desktop and laptop computers. Leaving aside e-commerce, which is still only 8% of retail sales, we still have human beings at checkout counters in retail stores. We still have the shelves stocked by humans. We still have humans behind the deli counter slicing up meat and cheese. We've had virtually no change in decades in the technology used in construction or home maintenance. In medicine, the big advance in the last 15 years has been electronic medical records, but they work with the doctors and nurses who are still basically doing the same thing. The only difference is now when you go in to see your doctor for your annual checkup, the doctor spends more time looking at the computer screen than looking at you. And higher education, with its enormous cost inflation as the ratio of administrative staff rises compared to instructional staff. We professors are a shrinking share of the costs of the university. So let's play Find the Robot. Robots are everywhere in automobile and computer manufacturing. The first industrial robot was installed by General Motors back in 1961. And by the mid-1990s, in auto factories that I was privileged to tour, robots had taken over large parts of the welding together of the auto body and had pretty much taken over the paint shop, freeing human workers of the noxious fumes of the painting process. But robots are so far almost nowhere outside of manufacturing and warehouses. And in the Wall Street Journal just last week, on November 11th, there was a long story about some of the reasons why the robots have disappointed the great promise that they would take over for many human activities. They're very crude in the tactile feelings that they can develop with their mechanical fingers. The hardest thing for a robot to do is fold the laundry. They're only beginning to learn how to deal with the flexibility of fabrics. Robots have a hard time walking up and down stairs and often fall over, and the Wall Street Journal story is illustrated by a mechanical robot flat on his face after having fallen over. Now, I will concede that there are a few robots outside of manufacturing, and I saw 3 of them last night in the local studios of Channel 3 WCAX TV, because unlike my last visit, my friend from college was formerly the owner of that station. And so in the tour we had last night, the striking thing was how few people were there compared to the last time I was there 20 years ago. And all the cameras in the studio for the 11 o'clock news last night were robots. So I've got to concede they're beginning to make their inroads elsewhere. Some innovations don't have entirely positive effects. We know that auto deaths have stopped decreasing and have started increasing due to distracted driving as a result of the use in the wrong setting of smartphones. Technology has brought us viruses, hacking, and identity theft. In universities, we have enormous extra expense to pay for all of the information technology personnel that are necessary to keep our classrooms and laboratories going. A lot of innovation is going into directions that don't directly raise business productivity and their ability to pay higher wages and hire more workers, including video games and virtual reality goggles. Clean energy innovation is a great thing for cleaning up the air and dealing with climate change, but it's not a direct creator of business productivity. So if innovation is proceeding slowly and we're still creating lots of jobs, why should we worry? Well, we should worry because of the quality of the jobs. two things have gone on. First of all, we've had job polarization, which is a hollowing out of the middle, with growth in jobs that are high-skilled, require a college education, and we've had growth in jobs that are low-skilled in retailing, fast food restaurants, and other low-skilled occupations. Flipping burgers and making beds is not a rewarding or high-paying way to spend a working life. There's been a decreased demand for middle-skilled workers that used to belong to labor unions and have stable, relatively high wages and look forward to a full career working in a factory. And the disappearance of these jobs, not just because of free trade, but also because of more and more machines replacing people, we've had very serious social and economic consequences for middle-aged men who have lost those middle-skilled jobs. Now, we'll come back to the problems of the men, but let's turn now to some of the headwinds that are slowing down the process of growth. I already showed you that graph that had the red and blue areas showing the shrinkage and then the growth and then the shrinkage again in hours per person. The fewer hours our population work, the less output there is to distribute to each person. And we've had a decline in hours of work per person for the last 15 years, as I think I mentioned before, due partly to the retirement of the baby boom generation, which started about 10 years ago, and also the dropping out of the labor force of many middle-aged, aged 25 to 54, particularly men, but also to some extent women. The participation of men aged 25 to 54 was 98% were either working or looking for work in 1953, and that's down now to 88%. So fully 12% of our adult men in that age category are neither working nor looking for work. And what are they doing? Some of them are on Social Security disability, but a lot of them, according to time use studies, are playing video games. Among the high school graduates or those who have less than a high school education, that participation rate has gone from 97% to 84%. And we have the lowest male and female participation rate of any of the so-called OECD, the developed countries, besides Italy. Here's the history of the labor force participation rate going back to 1950. And you see the enormous increase that was brought about by the arrival of women who left the home thanks to the invention in part of modern appliances, and also the fall in the birth rate after the baby boom generation was over. And so we had this enormous increase in labor force participation as women entered the labor force, and this raised the number of hours our population were working and pushed up our standard of living. But that increase stopped around 1990. We had a plateau for a while, and then a very sharp decline in the labor force participation rate in the last 10 years. It's only leveled off in the last 2 years. And one of the big elements of suspense and uncertainty among economic forecasters is how much more can employment grow? How much more will we be able to bring back some of these prime age workers who've dropped out? Now, this loss of middle-skilled jobs, particularly for men, has had very serious consequences. They have become less attractive marriage partners because they cannot earn a steady income, and in many cases, women don't find that an attractive proposition to be married to someone who cannot support a family. That has led in part to a decline in marriage, and then in turn to the consequences for children of growing up in single-parent families. I should not say single family, I should say single parents. And we've had very serious consequences as a result of this labor force dropping out and detachment of many males from social interaction that has led to very unfortunate consequences. Now, the obstacles that face men who've lost these middle-income jobs are profound because they're partly cultural. We know that a number of jobs have traditionally been considered women's jobs: nurses, school teachers, secretaries, various kinds of health personnel. And it's very hard to convince men to go into those fields, but that's where the jobs are growing as the jobs in manufacturing are shrinking. Women tend to be better at social skills and social intelligence. And there are obstacles to moving to better jobs. In medium and small towns where the only factory or factories have closed, what do people do? They don't want to move and leave their extended family, which to some extent they may need for support. And often the closing of the factory has reduced the price of houses in those depressed communities and made it impossible for people to get enough money from selling their house to be able to go and afford to live in some of the parts of the country where the jobs are growing more rapidly. As men drop out of the labor force and as unions decline in their importance, we've had a detachment of men from social interaction through the union hall, through the Catholic Church or other churches. The interactions that people had after their jobs by sharing a beer at the nearby bar. We've also had a change from the compliant wife to women who want more independence and don't want unemployed men relying on them. Males who did not complete college, who have a high school education or less, have a 51% divorce rate. And often that is the women leaving the men because of infidelity, domestic violence, and substance abuse. And this then leaves the men off on their own without the civilizing influences of marriage and children. So if you want to look at some startling statistics, and these are areas in which the United States is falling behind a number of the other developed countries. For white high school graduates, the percentage of their children born out of wedlock went up over the last 30 years from 4 to 34%. For black high school graduates, it went up from 48 to 74%. And here's a really dramatic change. This comes from Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. Charles Murray was accused of being a racist for making slurs on the intelligence of minority populations. And so he decided he would get out of that stigma by writing a book totally about the white population. And he focused on the top 20% of the white population that he called Belmont, and the bottom 1/3 of the white population that he called Fishtown, after a poor area in Philadelphia. And so here's his most startling statistic from the Fishtown population, the bottom 1/3 of the white population, which you can think of as high school dropouts, and at least some of the people who have just completed high school. For 40-year-old women, the percent of children living with both biological parents in this group declined over the 50 years, 1960 to 2010, declined from 95 to 34%. That is an incredible change in the percent of children living with both biological parents. Now we've got other problems with men. And here we're going to look at the ratio of women to men in college education, and the thick red line that steadily rises refers to the white population, and that's the one I want to focus on. So in the middle you have 0. Coming down on the left-hand axis, you have -2, -4, -6, -8. And so back in 1975, the percentage of women completing college was 8% less than the percent of men completing college. That female-to-male ratio steadily improved. It crossed zero at about 1995, about 20 years ago, and it has continued to rise until now we have roughly 8% gap between the number of women completing college and the number of men. And that leads to a problem that if college-educated women want to marry college-educated men, there aren't enough college-educated men to go around. What are some of the consequences of these single-parent families? The children in single-parent families grow up without the steadying influence of a father. And sociological studies have shown that there is a distinct difference in the intellectual growth of sons and daughters, with the sons being slower to develop in households without fathers. Much of the development of the young child's brain occurs in ages 0 to 2, and the absence of parental leave in the United States compared to many other countries means that children are often left by their parents at very early ages when they need the nurturing to develop normally. And there are other indications of adverse consequences for children growing up in single-parent families. Between 1979 and 2008, the percentage of white high school dropouts with prison records rose from 4 to 28% for whites, and for blacks from 15 to 68%. So we have a definite correlation between single-parent families dropping out of high school and becoming engaged in criminal activity. Now, a couple of years ago, a professor of economics at Princeton named Angus Deaton, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize in economics, came up with startling figures for the mortality record of Americans, whites, without a high school education. And what we see here in the blue line with the dots that goes down is the mortality rate of blacks steadily improving. In other countries, mortality is steadily improving as healthcare becomes better and as people stop smoking. But the red line shows for high school or less educated white non-Hispanics, the death rate has gone up, something that's not occurring almost anywhere else in the world. And here again, the red line in the left frame, the left and right frames are a slightly different version of the same thing. The red line on the left shows the mortality rate, the number of deaths per 100,000 people, rising in the United States and falling everywhere else, falling rapidly in France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, and Sweden. So here again, we have a story in which innovation is slowing down for all the developed countries, but the United States is developing a peculiar and unique set of sociological problems highlighted by this increase in the mortality rate. And last year was the first year in more than a century that instead of improving, life expectancy actually became shorter. So this extended view of the demographic headwind, the dropping out of the men, reduces growth in hours of work, it reduces growth in total output. The decline and postponement of marriage reduces the fertility rate and the rate of population growth. The slower the population growth, the fewer young people we have to pay the taxes to support the Social Security and Medicare of the older generation. The health consequences of dropping out have raised the mortality rate through where are these deaths coming from with this rising mortality rate? Suicides, alcohol addiction, and opioid addiction. We're now up to 60,000 deaths a year coming from opioids alone. And the consequences of all these single-parent families cast a shadow on the future educational attainment and employability of their children. Now, that's the demographic headwind. What about the education headwind? A major driver of productivity growth throughout most of the 20th century was the steady increase in educational attainment. In 1900, only 10% of people completed high school. By 1970, that was up to 80%, a huge driver of productivity growth. Now, we still have 15 to 20% of our population not completing high school. Most people who go to two-year community colleges drop out and do not complete. College completion is gradually rising, but 40% of recent college graduates were unable to find a job that requires a college education, and 15% of American taxi drivers have college educations. On top of that, with American higher education, you have high and rising costs and growing indebtedness, with the amount of student debt now up to $1.4 trillion. The upper faint pink line shows the percent of the population that had completed high school going back to 1940, and you'll see that that faint pink line at the top showing the percent of 25 to 29-year-olds that had completed college reached a plateau around 1975, and it's been virtually level since, with a slight uptick at the end. The thick red line at the top shows for the entire population how many had completed high school, and that is also leveling off. Of course, the line for everyone lags behind the line for 25 to 29-year-olds. And then the same for college, shown at the bottom, with for the 25 to 29-year-olds, the faint pink line at the bottom grew more rapidly in the early period than it's grown since. Here is another way of looking at the percent of the population that's completed four-year college, and the crossing point with the women moving ahead of the men back in the early 1990s, and the percent of women greatly exceeding that of men, particularly over the last 10 years. When you look at international comparisons, the United States does very poorly in the international tests given with the same material to 15-year-olds in 34 different countries. On the most recent one, carried out a year or so ago, the U.S. ranked 17th in reading, 20th in science, and 27th in math. The U.S. used to lead the world in the percentage of our population that went to college, thanks to the GI Bill after World War II. But we've now fallen down the league table to number 16 in college completion as a percent of the population. And we're somewhere around the same rank in the percent of high school dropouts. And this alone, this slowing down in the improvement of educational attainment, will take about a third of a percentage point off our productivity growth over the next 25 years as compared to our average performance in the 20th century. And then, after demography as a headwind, after education as a headwind, we have the inequality headwind. Over the last 20 years, fully 52% of all the gains in income have gone to the top 1% of the income distribution. The gains for the top 1% was 95%, almost a doubling of real inflation-adjusted income. For the bottom 99%, the growth of income was only 15%. So how does this factor into economic growth? If all the money is going to the top, it means the average, including the people at the top, is growing faster than the median, the performance of the people in the middle. And so for the people in the middle, our economic performance is even worse than those charts reveal that were shown earlier. And the rise in inequality is not over. Just think of the ways it's occurring, with multi-million-dollar annual income of sports and entertainment stars. Beyonce, $100 million last year, not just 10 or 15 million. There are at least 50 celebrities that made more than $50 million last year. Chief executive officers used to be paid 30 times as much as the ordinary worker. Now they're paid 300 times as much. At the same time, firms are pushing workers out of employment status into contract status without benefits, forcing people into part-time work instead of full-time work without benefits. And we've had the decline in unions and the purchasing power of the minimum wage. This chart goes back further than any of my other charts, goes back to 1920, and shows for different countries the share of the top 1% in income. And we started out in the 1920s with most of these countries, the top 1% had a share of income ranging from 15 to 20%. There was a great equalization that came in the Great Depression and World War II. And so by the 1970s, the income share of the top 1% had fallen from about 20% down to 8%. That's still substantial inequality, but still less than there was. Now look at what's happened since the late 1970s. The top blue line is the United States. The top 1% of the income distribution is now back with an income share above 20%. Canada and the UK come next, and Japan and France have had virtually no increase in income inequality. So again, the United States is unique. The problems of innovation affect all the developed countries, but the United States stands alone in some of these headwinds. Not all the headwinds. The demographic headwind is actually more significant in Japan and Korea, which have lower fertility, no immigration, and a higher and growing share of people over the age of 65, putting a great fiscal burden on the rest of the population. Now here's something I think most people would find shocking. We have 5 pairs of bars arranged by income, with the lowest 20% of the income distribution on the left and the top 20% of the income distribution on the right. The blue bars show for people aged 50 years old how long they could expect to live if they were born in 1930 or if they were born in 1960. For the poorest group on the left, the number of years you could expect to live from age 50 was 26.6 if you were born in 1930, and it actually decreased. It got worse to 26.1. So you add 26 to age 50, that's a life expectancy of 76 years for people at the bottom. Then look at the people at the top over on the right. From age 50, they could expect to live to be about 82 if they were born in 1930, and they could expect to live to be about 89 if they were born in 1960. So tremendous improvement in life expectancy for people at the top, and an enormous gap of 12 years of life expectancy between the poorest group and the richest group. The poorest living until age 76 and the richest living until age 89. And just think of the inequity of Social Security when low-income people not only get smaller Social Security checks per year, but they die too soon to get their full entitled Social Security benefits, whereas the better off people live so much longer. Then the fourth headwind is simply the effect of the retirement of the baby boom generation and the rising share of people over the age of 65 on the federal budget, on the expenditures for Social Security and Medicare. This is a projection of what will happen to the ratio of total federal debt to GDP, how big the debt is in relation to the size of the economy, starting now at about 78% and going up over 100% by about 15, 20 years from now. So if you take all these headwinds together, it's not a pretty story. The demographic headwind reduces hours per person. The education headwind reduces productivity growth. The inequality headwind reduces median growth of incomes below average growth. And the fiscal headwind means that to stop that inexorable rise in the debt to GDP ratio, we're going to have to cut benefits, raise taxes, or raise the retirement age. Now you put it all together, and this is almost the end. I look out into the future and come up with several different measures of where we're going compared to where we've been in the past. Now, looking over at the left, we have output per hour, that's productivity. In the period since 1920 up until now, productivity has grown at 2.25% per year. My prediction, and this comes straight out of the book, is over the next 25 years, we're going to have productivity growing at 1.2%, about a full percentage point less. Now that 1.2% really, from today's perspective, looks pretty good because the actual growth achieved by the economy in the last 7 years has only been half that amount, about 0.6% for productivity. Moving over to the second pair of bars, the growth in income per person was, as I said earlier, historically around 2%, to be precise, 2.1. And that's going to grow slower at a rate of only 0.8. Why does output per person grow slower than output per hour? Because the number of hours per person are shrinking, due particularly to the retirement of the baby boom generation. Then if inequality continues to increase, the median output per person, instead of growing at 1.8% a year, would only grow at 0.4. And then the final pair of bars looks at disposable after-tax income, and I conjecture that will grow even slower if we have higher taxes or lower benefits because of the growing burden of the elderly generation. So my conclusions are that 70% of all the growth in total factor productivity since 1890 occurred in the middle 5 decades of the 20th century and can be attributed to the miracle of the second industrial revolution. The big impacts on total factor productivity of the third industrial revolution were less, they lasted shorter, and they were largely completed by 2005. We've got lots of innovation. I can talk more about it in our discussion period. Autonomous vehicles, smartphones, 3D printing, artificial intelligence. But at least so far, this set of innovations has had less impact on productivity than the earlier innovations going back to electricity and the motor car. Much of the slowdown in our future growth is caused not by faltering innovation, but by the headwinds and their effects in pulling down growth in median income per person. Slowing innovation is shared across all the developed countries, while aspects of the headwinds are US-centric. But there's a real dichotomy about what may seem to be a pessimistic view of the future and an optimistic view of the future. Because there are those that I call the techno-optimists that think we're about to embark on a fourth industrial revolution where artificial intelligence and robots take over all the jobs. And those people, while optimistic about productivity growth, are very pessimistic about jobs. They think that the jobs are going to be largely taken away. A pair of economists at Oxford predicted 4 years ago that 50% of the jobs would disappear within the next 20 years. And we can come back to their forecasts in the discussion period. I take the opposite point of view. I'm more pessimistic about the pace of innovation and the breadth of the impact of artificial intelligence and robots on the many jobs that we still have left as we've achieved our 4.1% unemployment rate. So to end on a happy note, while I may be pessimistic about productivity growth, I think there are lots and lots of jobs in your and my future. Thank you. So let's have some questions. I see an eager beaver here in the front row.
I have a quick comment and a question. The comment has to do with an earlier remark you made, and it doesn't have anything to do with the modern period. I'm an economic historian of medieval Europe, and I would probably quibble that there was no economic growth in the Middle Ages, because I consider the 9th through the late 13th century to be a very strong period of growth, based on population growth, technological change, and public spending. But in any case, that's a small quibble. My real question is one that I wanted to ask last night, actually, has to do with what is really helping to fuel these first two revolutions, in particular, these first two industrial revolutions. Don't you think that public spending, in particular investment in socially useful targets, are part of the reason why we had such growth in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, public spending behind the construction of railroads, and the public spending that occurred in the 20th century, in the period that you're highlighting here in the middle of the 20th century, focusing on the GI Bill, the interstate highway system, also certainly technology as well, military spending that helped create the internet. Isn't that also what's really behind this great productivity growth? And one of the reasons why we're not encountering that now is that public spending seems to be shifting more toward increasing inequality and supporting interests of shareholders and so on.
Yeah, I completely agree, although when we talk about what public spending is shifting toward, you'd have to recognize that the biggest shift is toward transfer payments, toward Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. But if you go back, just to add to your list, not only did government land grants make possible the rapid expansion of U.S. railroads, but we also had the agricultural experiment stations that greatly enhanced productivity in agriculture, and we had the establishment of the land-grant state universities, which brought the United States ahead of the rest of the world in the percentage of students who completed college. As I mentioned, we slipped from number 1 to number 16 by that metric. And then in the 20th century, the effects of World War II on productivity are mysterious but quite profound. We came out of World War II with a level of economic activity that was much higher than you could explain by the previous rate of growth up to the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929. And the interstate highway system was one of those inventions you could only do that once. You only need to put a 4-lane limited access highway across the middle of Wyoming once. You don't need to keep doing it. And the ability to drive from coast to coast without a traffic light was a miracle that we marveled at back when I was in graduate school in the 1960s, and one new segment after another of the interstate highway system was completed. So we are not investing in public investment. It's not just that we're slipping. As a share of our total economy, our investment in public investment is roughly half of what it was back in the heyday of the interstate highway system. So I fully support your general theme.
I know you came with Joel Moak here and we're debating, and so I have some questions about that. I went to his talk yesterday afternoon, and he talked about adverse effects of technology, and for him, the technological fix was the answer. That I think he explicitly said, in terms of climate change, that there would be no way of agreeing politically to reduce carbon emissions, and so you had to go for carbon capture. And I totally disagree with that, and I'd like your take. And then another thing, he characterized...
Why do you disagree?
Oh, well, I think that these, first of all, the technology solution is just a transfer of money to big corporations and that the climate deniers are now, the corporate climate deniers have sort of shifted their view. Instead of saying that there's no climate change, they're saying, yes, there is, and we can save it. The other thing, I think that these things, especially the idea of putting sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, is just so scary that I don't know what to say about it, and I just have my doubts about carbon capture. And so the other thing, he characterized your position in terms of science. He said that what you say is that we've solved all the low-hanging fruit and that all the easy problems have been solved and we won't be able to solve the hard problems. And I'd like your take on that as well.
First reaction is, I only predict out 25 years. 50 years, 100 years from now, the extent to which jobs have been replaced by robots, I don't think is within our power to predict, but we've got enough problems to focus in on the next 20 or 25 years. I don't think all the problems have been solved. We are engaged in innovation that is going to directly address several issues involving climate change that won't directly improve business productivity, but will address climate change. In particular, I'm thinking on the one hand of wind and solar power. We've had a huge decline in the price of solar panels, partly due to imports from China. And solar power is much more promising than it was 10 years ago. There have been big technological improvements in batteries. The problem with solar power is how to provide the power at night when the sun goes away or when it's cloudy. And improved battery technology is helping with that. In addition, there has been enormous progress, as everyone knows, with electric cars. And if we wanted to predict anything that's going to change over the next 20 years, it's probably easiest to predict that we'll have nationwide charging stations that are almost as ubiquitous as today's petrol gas stations. And electric cars don't require as much maintenance, they don't pollute the air, and if we had a 100% conversion to electric cars, not over the next 20 years, but over the next 50 years, that would make a major contribution to not just stopping the growth of carbon emissions, but turning them around. And I'm certainly, like most economists, an advocate of the carbon tax, particularly not only for the disincentive to emit carbon that is imposed on the economy, but also all that tax revenue and what we could do with the tax revenue in terms of preschool education or a single-payer medical system.
Somewhat morbid. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio originally, and 4 years ago, well, after the recession hit Cleveland, there were so many unoccupied buildings. 4 years ago, I had two cousins who, one worked for Ford, one worked for a manufacturing company in Lorain, Ohio, and they both killed themselves, and they were fathers of children. And I wondered if there's been another time in the history of industrial revolutions where people have lost so many jobs that it really destroys, people lost their jobs, there was no help from the government, and then this led into the opiate crisis. Many kids whose parents lost their jobs are now the people who are of these issues, and I wondered if there's been another time where you can pinpoint that.
Today's loss of jobs is absolutely no comparison. It shrinks into almost insignificance compared to the Great Depression, when in 1932 and 1933 we had unemployment rates of 25%. But you didn't see the same decline in marriage. You saw people sticking together and trying to help each other. We went through an entire decade of the 1930s with unemployment above 10% for more than 10 years, and we were pulled out of the Great Depression only by rearmament and World War II. So yes, I think that is an example that helps to put today's problems into context because we did not have opioid addiction. I think we did have an increase in suicide during the Great Depression. But today's problems, I think, are unique, and they're particularly unique because the increase in mortality among those with a high school education or less is unique to American whites. It's not even applying to the Black and Hispanic United States population.